Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jenn.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Welcome to season 3, everybody. We made it. All right. It's pretty exciting. Right, guys? You're there?
Yes. Yeah.
Woohoo! Season 3.
Woohoo! Season 3.
Season 3. All right. So we were really pumped about all of our guests that are going to be coming on this season, sharing their insight and their knowledge with us. We have a special episode here because we have a husband and wife duo that are going to be talking to us about their research in growth mindset in the music theory classroom specifically. And so we are really pleased to have Dr. Shana Southard-Dobbs and Benjamin Dobbs with us. And Jenn, you're going to read Shana's bio, and then Ben, you'll take Ben's bio.
All right. So Shana Southard-Dobbs is Associate Professor of Psychology and Principal Investigator of the Stress and Cognition Lab at Lander University in Greenwood, South Carolina. She earned her PhD in experimental psychology with a minor field in educational psychology at the University of North Texas in 2016. Her primary research interests focus on post-traumatic stress, autobiographical memory for stressful experiences, and the role of cognitive factors in shaping trauma outcomes. Dr. Southard-Dobbs also routinely engages in scholarship of teaching and learning research.
And Benjamin Dobbs is Assistant Professor and Coordinator of Music Theory and Composition at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. He earned his PhD in music theory with a related field in music history from the University of North Texas in 2015. His research interests center broadly on the development of musical style and musical thought during the Protestant Reformation in Middle and North Germany. Benjamin also studies the relationships among students' beliefs about learning, learning behaviors, and learning outcomes in music theory classes.
It's really about the theories that we all kind of hold internally about our own intelligence and our abilities. And the original kind of language that I understand WEG used was an incremental versus an entity sort of theory about those abilities. Entity means it's like part of me. I am a good musician. I am a strong performer. I am good at music theory, or I'm not, right? And then incremental is more like, that's a space where I have room to grow.
I think we've probably all either had students or periods in our life where we're like, man, I am teaching these students that they can't do music theory, and I hate that. So I started to examine pretty early on in my time at Furman to find ways that I thought would encourage my students from an I can't do this mindset to an I can't do this yet mindset.
So hello and welcome again to our episode. We're really excited because this is actually a first for us. We have 2 guests who are both academics and they both live in the same house. We are so excited. I don't think that's happened before yet. No, I don't think so. And so we are so excited to have Benjamin and Shana with us. But of course, we always like to ask our guests a little bit about their background, kind of how they got into their respective fields. And so, we can talk to you, Benjamin, about how you got into music theory, and Shana, how you got into psychology, and then who wins most of the arguments at home? Because I was kind of thinking about this. You have a music theorist who's very logical, can create a good, concise argument, but you also have a psychologist who can get kind of underneath about kind of like, all right, well, what kind of trauma or, what's really going on there? So I don't really know who would win that argument. So whoever wants to go first can go ahead.
Yeah. So guys, thanks so much for having us on the pod. We're really excited to speak with y'all today. Let's see. So I started playing piano at a really young age. I think that's a pretty typical story. I was playing piano at age 5. I think that was a 5th birthday present, was piano lessons. And then I, did band in school, and I grew up in a really small town. Actually, I grew up on a farm outside of the small town. And as far as I knew, I wanted to be a musician. I knew that, but all I knew is that, professions available to me were either to be a church music director, but that wasn't a full-time gig. You could be a piano teacher, but you had to be, with apologies, in my mind, in my 10-year-old mind, you had to be an old lady to be a piano teacher. Apologies. Or you could be a band or choir director. And I was a band person, so I went to college thinking I was going to be a high school band director, did music ed for a couple of years. And then I remember in sophomore theory, I think it was 3rd or 4th semester, we had an analysis project that was a form analysis of a Mozart symphony. I think my group analysis was Symphony 39, maybe. And I remember just falling in love with it and working on it like all night long and thinking, man, it would be really cool if I could just do this for a living. So I pivoted from music ed and landed in the music theory world. And I was really fortunate that that happened pretty early in my educational career. And I've been there ever since.
Great. And you, Shana?
Yes. So I always really enjoyed science and math in school. I was good at it. I also grew up in rural Arkansas. So Ben and I have known each other for a very long time. We met way back in band in school, actually. So our school did a really good job of covering the basics. We had good science and math and English classes. But I was never exposed to social and behavioral science. I'm so jealous of my students who took a psychology class in high school because I didn't have that exposure. So I didn't know until I got to college and was doing my pre-med biology, chemistry major thing. I took general psychology as a gen ed class. And the heavens opened and I realized, oh, this whole time I have been a behavioral scientist. Looking back on how I thought about people and the observations that I made about the world around me. So I'm really glad that I had that opportunity to have that realization, because my life really changed after that semester. So yeah, psychology is all about applying the tools of science. So I am a scientist to the study of human behavior, cognition, and emotion, which is just the right space for me.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I love how both of you entered college, maybe adjacent to where you would end up, but it was like having an experience, having a class, having something like that opened your mind to what's possible. Because I think a lot of times, my dean and I have talked many times about the fact that most of my theory majors start out as something else, and then they realize, oh, music theory is a thing that exists and I like it, So it's often true. I mean, that's what happened to me. I didn't know when I was registered for Music Theory 1, I was like, what is that? So, now
I should point out that Shana has a background in college music as well.
I
Did you mention this, Shana?
Yeah, I was a music minor, actually. So I was in band all through school. I actually was playing saxophone in jazz and symphonic bands while I was working on my master's degree in counseling. So, I mean, I'm a musician, an amateur musician. Now, like church choir is the lane that I stay in pretty much. I'm a music theory dropout. Let's turn this into a true confession podcast for a second. Yeah, I had finished all of my coursework for my music minor and was in my very last music theory class. And I was like, this minor was for fun and this is not fun. So I bounced. And then I married a music theorist. So,
Right. I think when you told me that you were dropping your music minor, you got very serious and said, Benjamin, I have to tell you something. I'm dropping out of my music theory class. And it was, it was just fine. But I think you were a little nervous about telling me that.
But it turned out okay. So
that could have been a done deal. The relationship's over. You know?
Sorry, but bye.
Once you got past that, you knew the rest is going to be history. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, we're really excited to chat with both of you about kind of a project that you're currently kind of working on about growth mindset, which is one of those kind of buzzwords, I think, within the past few years that's been thrown around all levels of education. But would you kind of start our conversation just with kind of telling us really kind of what growth mindset is to you, and why is it important for college instructors to understand what that is?
Yeah. So before we dive in, I have a request, and that's that if you are in our listening audience and you are an undergraduate student who is currently participating or thinks you might participate in our study, would you mind closing this episode and listening, finishing up at a later date? It's just going to have to be a cliffhanger, but we don't want to influence any of your responses and participation if you happen to be participating in our study. So that's my small request.
Get out of here, undergrad
right.
TW students who might be trying to get extra credit from me or something.
Right, but come back later.
Later. All right. So now that they've all left and no one is listening anymore, now let's go into it.
Yeah. So mindset has been around for a while in the field of psychology, and then, of course, branched out into different educational spaces. So in digging into the research literature, of course, we have to point to psychologist Carol Dweck. She's the person who really came up with this framework. And when we dig down to the heart of it, Paul mentioned that things kind of get oversimplified sometimes when a concept kind of catches hold. And that kind of has happened with mindset. But if we dig down to the kind of original research on it, it's really about the theories that we all kind of hold internally about our own intelligence and our abilities. And that can be abilities in kind of any domain. And so it's what are the beliefs that we have about our intelligence and our abilities? And the original kind of language that I understand Dweck used was an incremental versus an entity sort of theory about those abilities. Entity means it's like part of me. I am smart. I am a good musician. I am a strong performer. I am good at music theory, or I'm not, right? And then incremental is more like that's a space where I have room to grow. I can improve. It is possible for me to, with practice, with effort, to get better at that thing. And then over time, the language has kind of evolved. We typically know this now as a growth mindset, which is akin to that incremental kind of theory, and fixed mindset, which is akin to that entity kind of theory. And unfortunately, as we have kind of adopted this terminology and this idea in educational spaces, it has tended to get a little oversimplified. It's fantastic that we're talking about it and thinking about it. But as a psychological scientist, I'm always drawn to the messiness, the nitty-gritty of it. And that's kind of what we're getting into with our research.
Mindset really entered music theory conversations, at least in publications and in research. At about 2015, 2016, we start to see several theorists starting to talk about mindset and its role in students' outcomes and performances in music theory classes. Tim Jeanette, Megan Naxer, Jan Miyake, Garrett Michelson have all written either about mindset or growth or mastery learning. So either mindset or mindset adjacent topics. That's really only been in the last 5 to 7 years or so. And these authors have really provided us with some fantastic tools to hopefully encourage growth mindset, some assessment practices or some praise practices, some study and practices that have hopefully fostered growth mindset among their students. And then our work is going to support this really great work, hopefully, by taking a step back and helping to establish a baseline understanding of mindset in music theory classes, providing that quantitative support to that excellent pedagogical framework that several authors have started to work with and talk about.
I think that's really good. I actually read the mindset book several years ago. A friend recommended it to me, and it's the version of the book that's not necessarily academic. She wrote kind of like a, popular, just buy it at Barnes and Noble version of her research on mindset. But I found it to be really transformative. And I think I realized as musicians, in many ways, we are often spoken to with a lot of fixed mindset, so to speak, language, like you're so talented, or, what a great horn player you are, or I don't think you should sing on your own, maybe just in a choir, right? Like all of these sort of things that feel very personal and feel like they're tied to some set amount of talent that we have. And so after I read the book, it really made me think both about my own approaches to things that I try that are new, trying to be more open-minded, like you can improve at anything that you work at, but it also changed the way that I talk to my students. So I went from being not super conscious necessarily about how I praise my students to being very conscious of praising things like effort and ability, and of always offering feedback to everyone, even really strong students, because strong students can still grow. And weak students need to hear other people receive feedback that they feel are maybe better than them. So it definitely has changed my teaching. So that makes me ask, how has interacting with growth mindset changed the way that you teach in your classrooms?
Yeah, so I really became interested in mindset when I first arrived at Furman. So that's where I'm at, and I arrived here in 2017. And Furman is it's a good school. We've got great students, hardworking students, pretty high achieving students who have always probably made A's or B pluses in school. And then when they got to Furman, which is a rigorous school, maybe that wasn't the case, especially in their music theory classes, where theory was something that was quite challenging for them. And so these students who have always gotten A's are all of a sudden getting homework assignments back or tests or quizzes where maybe they got a C or maybe they got a D. And I really noticed that my assessment, though it wasn't my intention, my assessments were convincing students that they couldn't do music theory, which was really heartbreaking, right? I think we've probably all either had students or periods in our life where we're like, man, I am teaching these students that they can't do music theory, and I hate that. So I started to examine pretty early on in my time at Furman. I started to examine my teaching practices to find ways that I thought would encourage my students from an I can't do this mindset to an I can't do this yet mindset, but I can soon, or with hard work, or with a lot of effort and practice and the right kinds of practice. So that's really how I got into mindset. And some examples of things that I started doing. I developed a homework redo policy that has kind of shifted and evolved over the years into a pretty robust assignment policy where students turn in homework. I provide feedback. I get it back to them. They can revise and resubmit and receive points back. And the goal here is to encourage students' continued engagement with their homework and their assignments and their assessments. And so I also offer multiple chances on quizzes and writing and other sorts of things to keep them from taking a piece of paper or now I do everything digitally, but from getting a file back, looking at a grade that they're not happy with and tossing it in the trash. I don't want that to happen. I want them to look at that grade, look at that feedback and say, all right, so I did all of this pretty well, but here are some things that I can do better or differently. And on the homework, when I return it to them, I make some notes. I don't correct. I make some notes. Think about this, or there are parallel fifths somewhere in this vicinity. Go find them and fix that. So that hopefully students are continuing to engage with their work and moving from, man, I can't avoid parallel fifths to, well, I'm going to avoid parallel fifths next time.
That's great, Ben. And honestly, I have to say, I read the original Carol Dweck study, and it was a little bit Greek to me, just to be honest with both of you, especially Shana. Here's my confession. I felt like I understood it, but I did come away with it thinking, okay, so now what? So I'm just so glad to hear like what you're doing. And it does remind me a lot of what Jan Miyake said here on her episode with us. So it's so glad to see, and so glad. Congratulations again to Jan on president-elect of the SMT.
Yeah.
But connecting back to that and trying to figure out how do we actually apply this, and then to connect obviously with a psychologist and say, whoa, oh my goodness, now we're really making groundbreaking strides because we have the connection to that kind of original research, and also we can apply it exactly to music theory. And gosh, we know we need this because music theory is just, it's such a right position for our field to be in, to make this step forward and have it blossom, as a result of your project. I'm going to forward it to all my students, definitely.
Awesome.
So I hope we get a lot of participants. I can't guarantee they'll respond. They don't usually respond that well to my emails, but maybe they will to yours. I hope so.
It's a universal problem, I think.
Right.
Well, there are 3 Amazon gift cards up for grabs. So.
There you go.
That's true.
Prizes.
So Ben, you've kind of teased us a little bit, but about this project. So Shana and Benjamin, can you tell us a little bit about what this research study is?
Yeah, so we're actually doing 2 studies right now. We started a study about a year ago. We launched it last fall, and this is confession time for me. So as I developed that homework redo policy and my multiple attempt quiz policy, I was really jazzed about it. And I thought, in line with all of those great music theory articles that I was reading, I'm really doing something that's going to foster great improvements and changes in growth mindset. I'm going to encourage growth mindset. And I came home and I was talking with Shana about it, super jazzed. And Shana said, but does it work?
We're theorists. It doesn't have to work. We theorize, right?
Yeah, well, I'm the theorist and Shana is the scientist. So, I mean, she sort of, she came at me, bro. And that got us to talking about how do we know whether or not our teaching practices are achieving what we hope they're achieving, especially when we're working with an interdisciplinary concept like mindset. How do we know? And so that's where Shana and I started this conversation, and that's where we're headed now.
And we actually, because we're both educators, we talk a lot, about our work and shared interests. And so my minor field for my PhD work is educational psychology, which is a really good complement to my training as an experimental psychologist. And a thing that I feel frustrated about sometimes as a professional educator is that it's not uncommon for me to have a realization that even things that I do, but things that we do in our educational practice is based in intuition. It seems like this should work, right? It seems that if I talk to my students in this way, that should improve or foster growth mindset. And educational practice is just kind of rife with that sort of thing. And there are some particular practices that we haven't actually examined carefully until relatively recently. Like, don't get me started on learning styles and teaching to different learning styles. Like Jen and I have had this conversation before. So that's a whole other episode. So this idea of like, but does it work? That's not, some people would take that as like almost a combative kind of question. Like, what do you mean? Does it work? Of course it works. But as a curious scientist, I ask that question with enthusiasm, with excitement, like, let's find out,
Yeah. So early last summer, so a year and some 4 months ago, we started talking about ways to see if my homework redos policy specifically was in fact fostering a growth mindset. And so we designed a study with my sophomore students at Furman. That's what I'm teaching right now at Furman. Designed a study to look at their mindset and any changes in mindset over the course of the entire year. So I teach theory 3 and 4. And over the course of the entire year, we checked in with students at the beginning of the first semester, end of the first semester, beginning of the second semester, end of the second semester, to see where their mindset was at each of those points in both written theory and in oral skills, to see if, well, maybe their mindset is the same in those different domains. Maybe it's different in those different domains, and maybe their mindset is differently malleable in those different domains. So we measured mindset and its change or not over the course of the year. And then we're looking to see if it's correlated with their participation in the homework redo policy. And our hypothesis is that students who have a higher level of growth mindset are more likely to take advantage of the homework redo policy. And then also students who take advantage of the homework redo policy at a higher rate will see a larger level of growth mindset. Now, we've done some preliminary data analysis, and our results have been a little bit, not disappointing, but a little bit frustrating. Furman is a small school. Out of 2 sections of music theory last year, I had a total of 17 students in 2 sections, which is fantastic for building close teaching relationships, but is absolutely terrible for collecting quantitative data and for drawing conclusions of this sort. So we are going to continue to do that study this year and probably next year too. So for a couple more years, just to see if we can get our participant numbers way up, and so that we can start to see whether some of the shifts in mindset, which we did see some shift in growth mindset, some increase in growth mindset, but with one exception, it was all statistically insignificant. So we hope that some larger numbers will show us either that it is in fact significant or that it's not. And both of those, if it is significant, that's fantastic. If it's not significant, then that's also important, because maybe we can stop doing all of these things that we're putting a lot of effort in to change growth mindset. Maybe it's just not, maybe we can't affect that. It's important to know that is sort of the scary part of turning the scientific tool inward and back on ourselves, right? That's a little terrifying. But you know what? If my teaching practices aren't effective, I want to know that. So that's our study that we started last year and that we're continuing. That study we launched with the assumption that mindset was malleable, with the assumption that mindset is malleable. So now Shana convinced me that we needed to take a step back, especially after we looked at that preliminary data. We needed to take a step back and to say, is mindset malleable? So Shana, can you talk to us about some of the research that there is about mindset malleability?
Yes. So the short answer to that question is mindset malleable, broadly speaking, is yes. There is, quite a bit of evidence that the answer to that question is yes. Much of that research has been conducted in K through 12 settings. And there's enough research now that it's getting pretty nuanced. And so, it's not so simple, basically. And I mean, that's true in like every educational intervention, essentially. It depends is my favorite thing to say, basically.
And an undergraduate student's favorite thing to hear.
Right. Right. Actually, I say that a lot in my psychology classes. I'm like, you psychology majors can always get away with answering a question. It depends. And they're like, cool. And I go, but wait, you have to follow that up with some sort of substantive, commentary. Oh, okay. So is mindset malleable? Yes, there's evidence, a lot of evidence from K through 12, and it kind of depends on what you're doing and a lot of other factors. Unfortunately, the educational environment And so in our study that Benjamin mentioned a few minutes ago, we are also measuring quite a few other variables like class size and institutional settings and those kinds of things to see what might be related to that. There's less evidence from the higher education setting, although there is a fair bit. And most of that is in STEM settings, like science and math. And so we were not able to find, I believe this is correct, any like quantitative studies in the field of music theory specifically, kind of asking that question, is mindset malleable? So we need to do it. We need to measure it.
Yeah, so mindset is broadly speaking malleable in K-12 situations and in some STEM situations. It looks like it is, but we haven't examined that from a quantitative perspective in music theory classes. So that's really the base level question that we're hoping to ask or to answer with this big study that we have just launched. You might have gotten an email from me about it today, or you might in the coming days about recruiting participants from all over. So we are hoping to run this study with participants from universities across the country, across the world, at big schools, small schools, private schools, public schools, big class sizes, small class sizes. We want to know about mindset and mindset malleability in music fundamentals courses or in different points throughout the core sequence, third semester, fourth semester, or in an upper level theory elective, in a counterpoint class or a form analysis class. We are focused on undergraduate, so this is not AP, this is not before college, and this is not graduate student. But still, we're looking at that, 4, 5, 6 year chunk when, from music fundamentals in college until upper level electives to see if mindset is malleable in those different contexts. Because it could be that mindset malleability changes throughout the educational life cycle of an undergraduate student. And all of that is really important for informing our pedagogical practices as music theorists, knowing, hey, my student is at this level, and I know that their mindset is really susceptible to malleability. Or, hey, I've got students at this level and their mindset's pretty fixed by now. So I actually am not going to worry about fostering growth mindset too much. I'm going to turn my attention toward other things that have a greater efficacy for achieving the learning outcomes that I want to achieve. So that's our goal, is to establish this baseline understanding of mindset and mindset malleability. With this study, we are asking participants, we're asking faculty members to recruit their students to participate. And then we're going to ask students to fill out a survey at the beginning of a term and at the end of the term. So that will give us a baseline reading of mindset, but also that will help us to understand if mindset changed at all over the course of the semester. Hope we get a lot of participants from a lot of different kinds of schools, from different kinds of schools and programs, so that we can really start to unpack this question of mindset from a quantitative perspective.
Yeah, that sounds great, because as you talked about how we often teach intuitively, like that's just resonated with me, because so much of our teaching is either based on how we have been taught or our intuitions, right? I'm thinking back to when I used to do melodic dictations or harmonic dictations. I would often talk in between the hearings, be like, well, listen for this, or, you want to kind of be, pay attention to this. And then I'd play it again. And then I'd give a little hint or something like that. And I thought I was helping them. And then I came across a study where they did this study on like student responses with listening to direction in between hearings to no instructions. And students did better with the 0 instructions. The silence was better across the board than someone talking, even if you're saying something that you think is helpful. And intuitively, I thought, oh, I was guiding them through this melodic dictation, when in fact I was probably just giving them way too much information. I wasn't giving them time to actually think and listen, audiate for themselves. And if I wouldn't have read that study, and if someone actually wouldn't have put that together and kind of questioned those assumptions, I would still be kind of doing something that's probably helping rather than hurting. So I appreciate you doing this work, because it's important because we do have so much intuition baggage when we go to our own teaching.
Ooh, TM, intuition baggage. I like that, intuition baggage. Oh, and what you're describing, Paul, and I so appreciate that, is evidence-based practice, right? We expect medical practitioners and, mental health professionals to engage in evidence-based practice. We would accuse them of malpractice if they weren't doing that, right? But somehow in educational spaces, we kind of get away with winging it. I don't mean to say winging it. That's not true. We think very carefully, right? We engage deeply in our practice, but somehow, I don't know. We weren't all trained to engage in this evidence-based practice model.
Yeah,
it's true. In graduate school, even in pedagogy classes, sometimes we aren't given the tools even to look into the study of teaching and learning, which is its whole own thing aside from our specific disciplines. So yeah, for whatever that's worth, it is a separate kind of idea. The study of teaching and learning has its own set of terminology, its own set of, specialties and things like that. And we don't get into that almost at all in graduate study, if at all. I had 2 pedagogy courses. I don't think we ever talked about anything like that. It doesn't mean I didn't learn other valuable things, but I didn't read any of that research for sure.
I feel really lucky as a psychological scientist because there's so much overlap. There's a Society for the Teaching of Psychology is a division of the American Psychological Association. It's a really robust professional space. And we are doing extremely rigorous research on learning processes, like Jenn described, the scholarship of teaching and learning. But we already have those tools because it's part of our, kind of base training in the field. And then we just kind of turn a few degrees this way and pivot to apply those robust tools to, learning and teaching processes. So I recognize that that's not true for every field, right? But collaboration is a beautiful thing. I work in a very collaborative field. Science fields are very collaborative. It's not the norm for us to work on our scholarship totally alone. But I know that's not true necessarily in the humanities and other fields. So I would definitely encourage anybody who's thinking like, oh, maybe I want to do some of this kind of work, but I don't even know where to get started. Collaboration is the key to doing this kind of work for sure.
And it allows you to take the step back. A lot of the stuff that you read, just like Paul was mentioning, it's so specific. It's like, here's the practice of melodic dictation. You're all of a sudden you're out on this pinpointed limb of the tree instead of like something that's so more widely applicable. Like, is mindset malleable? Like, what a great question that so many of us can use knowing the answer to your study. That's so exciting. Because you go and you do things, and even if I read something that's the same study, like if Paul and I read the same study, or Jenn, or Ben and Furman, the way we apply that's going to be way different. So because my class is going to be way larger, and it's a way different setting than a small class at Furman. So the way we even apply those things, when the article is so specific, it loses applicability, in my opinion. So I'm really glad that, the collaboration allows you to take that step back and really reach a lot of people with your results. It's going to be really exciting. I'm so excited to see like the end. I'm already wanting to read the end result. I know everyone's probably like that, but I'm definitely in that camp now.
Yeah, let me say that we're also interested in doing this study. We're also interested in how mindset correlates with all those demographic questions that we mentioned and institutional questions that we mentioned. But we're also interested in looking at factors like instructor rapport, like how does that relate with instructor rapport and students' sense of belonging? How are, our classes are such intermixed spaces in so many different ways. There are so many different factors that impact our students' learning. So we're hoping to unravel or maybe entangle even more some of those questions and those factors.
Ben was pointing to something that I, as a researcher, I get really frustrated that no one study can achieve all the goals, right? That we have. Like, I want to both be able to answer a specific question and to generalize that. And it's just not possible. As an experimental psychologist, I want to design a really rigorous study with many controls. But you can't do that and also understand how that works in more real life settings. Right. And I tend to do more of kind of the lab-based experimental kind of work with the understanding like, oh, I really want to know how this looks in real life, though, because the way a student works, the way they think when they're sitting in in front of a computer in a tightly controlled laboratory setting is not how they think or behave, when they're in their dorm room or whatever.
That's right.
So I get really frustrated about that as a practitioner, as a researcher.
Well, it depends, Shana. That's what your answer is. Well, it depends. If they're sitting in front of their computer, then yes, but it depends, right?
And our two different studies kind of look at it from those different standpoints. The study that we're doing with my sophomores at Furman is a very, very controlled environment. I'm the only professor they have. I control not every aspect of their learning, but I control a lot of the factors that go into their learning. Our broader study that we're launching now, I don't have any control over what these students are doing at their various institutions. And so hopefully, that will give us some different takes on mindset in these different contexts.
For sure. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I'm dying to ask this question about IRB. I don't know if that's what you're going to, Jen.
Yes.
Because I think that would be something, I think a lot of people in the humanities, especially music theory, history, composition, we are lone wolves. We are in our office, doing our own thing. Rarely do we have human subjects and have to go through our university's internal review board. But you've had to do this for your research, Ben. So talk to us a little bit about working with the IRB and developing the kind of the study proposal, because that's something I think not a lot of music theorists have to do.
Yeah, that's something that I had never done before. Before we launched our first study a year ago, and so collaboration is key. If you can be married to a psychological scientist, I highly recommend it.
Yay, that's me.
That's right, Jenn. It's really handy in a lot of ways, but particularly in this way. So, but if you aren't married to a psychological scientist or just can't find one, then go reach out to a social sciences researcher at university. That's going to be such a great. Maybe they'll want to collaborate with you, or if not collaborate, they can at least help you with the process. But our process really started foundationally from sitting down and discussing the kinds of research questions that we wanted to ask. We started with a blank slate and said, this is what I want to know. And we really poked at that and teased that out for quite a while before putting any limits on it. These are the kinds of things that I want to know, the kind of questions that I want to ask, the kind of answers that I want to find. And then there was a lot of negotiation about how we ended up asking those questions, because Shana was such a fantastic resource on saying, well, yeah, so this is what you want to know, but this is how we can measure it, or how we can't measure it, or how we keep our measuring it from being so complex that it's incomprehensible, right? Because I know nothing about doing that kind of research. Confession time. I know what I want to learn about my music theory classes, but I didn't know how to design a study so that we could effectively, succinctly, and clearly measure these kinds of things. So after we sat down and figured out what we wanted to ask, it took a long time for us to figure out how to ask that.
And there was a lot of negotiation in that conversation as well. I think that might have been the most frustrating part of this process for me, probably for Benjamin too. I'm picturing like times we've been at a coffee shop together with our, sitting across from each other with our computers, editing the Google Doc, and like fighting over what does this actually say right here? Because Ben's like, I want to know this. And I'm going, what kind of analysis am I going to do with those data, right?
Shana's a statistics wizard. She's fantastic at statistics, but there's a limit to her magic.
Well, right.
I hand her a Schenker graph and she has no idea what she's looking at.
I'm lost, right? And then we turn the tables there. Yeah. So, but that's also an idiosyncrasy of me. That's how I operate as a researcher. I want to know those things on the front end. What is this research question? How do I turn that into a testable hypothesis? What is the analysis I will need to do in order to answer that question? Not every, social and behavioral scientist operates that way. That's specific to me, but a lot of us do. Because we don't like to get stuck at the end going, I actually don't know how to analyze these data. Uh-oh.
That's how
folks, we can't even agree on how to say data or data.
So there's that.
Yeah. But that's all sort of meta design stuff. And then it got down to the nitty gritty of actually getting the study approved, because it has to be approved. It has to be legit if you're going to do anything with it scientifically. And so there is training that your institutional review board will have you do so that you are behaving in an ethical way with human participants. And that training will generally be really thorough. Like I could work with prison populations or minors or pregnant people. I don't need to do that, but that's part of that training. And that's a really important aspect. The institutional review board's primary goal, and Jenna, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the institutional review board's primary goal is to make sure that your research is ethical and that it is not harmful. Is that right, Shana? Is that fair to say?
Yes. So I actually serve on the institutional review board at my institution as a reviewer. And yes, our job is to ensure that researchers are minimizing risk of harm to their participants, which, the risk of harm is pretty low, probably in music theory, pedagogy research. But we just need to be sure and sort of maximizing benefits. And often when people are doing scholarship of teaching and learning, they're like, I don't know if I need to go through the IRB for this. These are things I was going to be doing anyway in my teaching. So do I or don't I? You can always consult with the person on your campus who is in charge of your institutional review board. And that is the thing you should do. Just check, and if they say, nah, you don't need to, then great. But in general, kind of a general rule of thumb is, are you interacting with human beings? Are you collecting information from humans? Yes. Okay. Step one. Are you collecting data that you even think you might want to share outside of your institution? Could you envision you might want to put together a conference presentation about this, or even publish it? Then definitely, yes, you're going to need to go through the IRB for this kind of work.
And most IRBs will have different levels of review. So exempt review or expedited review or full review. And I think probably for most music theory studies that folks might be interested in doing, probably going to qualify for exempt review, where there's a pretty short application process where you're going to describe what it is you're doing, why you're doing it. If you're using a survey, you're going to outline your survey, all the questions that you're going to include, describe how you're going to interact. If you have a TA, how the TAs are going to interact with your participants. But then that exempt review is generally a pretty quick process. And studies are generally approved for exempt review if there's very little likelihood of harm. And I think that's the case for most music theory research. Another really important part of the IRB process is developing and engaging in the informed consent process. Your participants have to know not necessarily what your study is about, because sometimes we want to shield that from our participants, but they need to know what it is they're doing. They're answering some questions, maybe. They need to know if there are any risks or if there are any benefits, if there are any financial incentives. They need to have all of that information at their disposal before they decide whether or not to participate. And so the IRB process, applying for IRB approval and developing an informed consent document that is as transparent about your study as you can be without influencing your participants' responses is a really important part of just minimizing harm and making sure that you are doing everything on the ethical up and up.
And something else about this kind of preparation, this kind of work that's often, I think, surprising for people who haven't done it before is that this is very front end heavy. The Institutional Review Board will want to know and see what questions are you going to ask, or they want a description of, what are you doing? What will your participants experience, basically? And here, research participants are your students. And that includes things like how are you going to recruit, participants into your study? So like for us, for example, we are communicating with you all, with the colleagues in the field, and saying, please, we invite you to share information about this study with your students, to invite your students to participate in this study. We wrote that message and it had to be approved by the Institutional Review Board, that recruitment language. So it's very front end heavy. And that's often surprising, I think, for someone who's never done that before. That's a standard part of my training as a psychological scientist. And I'm a trauma researcher. And so I go super mondo overboard when it comes to Institutional Review Board interaction, because the work that I do is extremely sensitive. So
another really important part of this is if you are doing research with your own students, like I am for my Furman-based sophomore study. If you're doing research with your own students, it has to be very clear that there is no coercion in encouraging students to participate. So, like, I can't know which of my students are participating or not until after I've submitted grades. It has to be very clear that students' grades are not at all related or influenced by their decision whether or not to participate. Students need to know that they can drop out of your study at any point without any sort of a backlash from you at all. So I have a couple of TAs who are undergraduate students at Furman who are doing participant recruitment and survey administration. I introduce the TA and then leave the classroom for 10 minutes while my TA does that. And the TA asks the student, please don't speak with Dr. Dobbs about your participation. Please don't tell him, because then there might be the possibility of coercion involved in recruiting students. And that's especially important if you want to do research with your own students, which I imagine some music theorists might if they're looking at the efficacy of their own teaching practices, which is how I got into this.
And of course, you could always, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think it would be useful if we were trained more on this type of research, because
Absolutely.
It's certainly valuable for us to be engaging in. But go ahead, Shannon.
I was just going to say, you could always collect information informally, right? Just for your own knowledge, right? And if you're doing that, you don't have to do all of this stuff, right? But if you're that committed to engaging in evidence-based practice, you might as well take the one or two extra steps to formalize that process, right? And then you're in the position to share what you learned with your colleagues as well.
I would not have wanted to gather all of this data without going through the IRB process. And then a couple of years down the line, be like, hey, well, I can talk about this in a symposium that I just saw a call for papers for, because I wouldn't be able to do that because I hadn't gone through the IRB process. So if you're going to go through all those steps to reflect on your own teaching practice, to learn about the efficacy, then go ahead and do the IRB work. And then, if Note Doctors organizes a symposium on mindset, then I could send my stuff in because I had gone through all of that process with the IRB and gotten that approval from the start. And
that's a great
idea. I would say that this all sounds kind of intimidating if you're just getting into it. And believe me, knowing nothing about research design in this sort of way, or quantitative methods or IRBs, it was very intimidating to me. And And so Shana's help was just immensely important. And so if you're interested in doing this kind of work, reach out to a social scientist on your campus, a psychologist, or even people in music ed sometimes have done this kind of quantitative research. So those can be, especially in larger departments, those can be really valuable resources. But collaboration is just so important here.
So hypothetically, this is just, hashtag asking for a friend. I'm sure no one ever does this, but those of us that submit the proposal get accepted. And then once you board the plane ride to the conference, you start writing your introductory paragraph. That's not going to fly with this type of stuff. Like I said, just asking for a friend.
That's right. That's not going to fly if you didn't get that IRB approval ahead of time. So,
turns into a descriptive sort of presentation at that.
It's very qualitative, I guess.
There you go.
These are the things that I would do if I were going to perhaps, we want to avoid that.
I don't know anyone that's ever done that in music theory. So,
Sure, Ben.
we might as well edit this out, Paul.
I don't know anybody who's done that in psychology either.
It's probably not possible there, but
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I have a question specifically for Shana, because we've talked a lot about collaboration and working across disciplines to create research opportunities. Obviously, you two are married, and so that collaboration is a pretty organic one. It came out of, already knowing each other and already discussing your work together a lot. But do you have suggestions for us music theorists who don't know anything about processes like this for approaching other colleagues about conducting research of this nature?
Definitely. The first recommendation I would have, and this is highly dependent on your institutional setting, is to connect with, if you have it, your Center for Teaching Excellence, your Center for Teaching and Learning. Larger institutions typically have this kind of unit. So they will be really well equipped and excited to work with you on this. So that would be like step one, I would say. And if you have graduate students listening, I want to make a plug for engaging with that kind of unit in your graduate career. I did that at UNT, at University of North Texas. That's where I got my PhD, and that's how we know each other, actually. I actually, my last 2 years of my PhD, worked in the Center for their version of the Center for Teaching Excellence. And the cross-collaboration, the cross-disciplinary interactions I had with graduate students from all over the university was amazing and wonderful and exciting. And so I start that as early as you can, I would say. And I know that you have graduate students who are listening, so definitely would nudge everyone in that direction. If you're at a smaller institution and you don't have that kind of unit or that kind of resource available, I would reach out to people in the psychology department, sociology department, education. This kind of work is part of our training, in the core work that we do in our field. And so it's just an extra step really to apply it to the question that you have in your teaching, in your pedagogy. I would be super excited to have a colleague from across my university approach me and say, would you be willing to work with me on this? I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. And I think that would probably be true of a lot of your colleagues in your behavioral and social science departments as well.
It's really helpful to know too that you're used to collaborating. So being approached in that way feels pretty normal and exciting, and like, yeah, let's see what we can come up with. Whereas when we're not used to collaborating, it feels like, oh, I'm asking this big thing of someone, when in reality, that's something that you would do regularly with other colleagues.
I'm so glad you said that, because it is such a normal part of the way that I do my work that I don't even think about it. It's just exciting. I even
think maybe the first time, Shannon and I were having these discussions about, well, how do you know whether or not it fosters growth mindset? I might have been like, do you want to do a study? Thinking that I, not sure entirely that this kind of collaboration that Shannon was going to be excited about it. And she was like, heck yeah. So even we've known each other for a long time, but I was a little nervous about reaching out too, just because, as theorists, we're often working in the dark, dusty basement by ourselves. But,
right.
Scientists, especially social scientists, are not. And so I think folks who are interested in doing this kind of collaborative research are going to get good, positive feedback.
Is it too early to ask who's going to be the first author on this paper, or is that still up for negotiation?
So that's a really important point, Paul. That kind of negotiation should happen from the very beginning.
Yeah.
That should not be negotiation that's going on during the process or after the process is done. And so early on, we decided that I would be first author and Shana would be second author. And, that didn't take a lot of negotiating between the two of us, but we did talk about the level of work that means, since I'm first author and Shana's second author. So I'm taking the lead on, developing the kinds of questions that we want to do, that we want to ask. I built our survey. I started the IRB documents. And I would say that I got us, really far down the line, and then Shana fixed everything because she knows how to do all of that sort of stuff. But that's what it means to be first author and second author, is to decide on a balance, to decide on an order, and then to be really transparent and clear about that. You should also, if you're interested in having undergraduate TAs, you should have that discussion, or graduate student TAs. You should have that discussion with them too, because their level of work may or may not warrant authorship. But that's something that needs to be transparent really from the beginning, and not, especially with students, not dangled in front of them along the line. So that was, I think, Paul, you asked it as a little bit of a joke, but that's a really important question to establish authorship early on in the process.
It is actually, and I'm glad, Jen, you made your comment a moment ago about disciplinary norms, because something you may not know is that, like, in psychology, that is a standard part of how we embark on any new project. We have that conversation, order of authorship. What does that mean about my time and effort, my contribution to this project? And we sort of continually negotiate that too. If it needs to change mid-project, that's not unusual. We have that conversation. And so you should know that if you're going to approach, a colleague across campus, that is a normal part of the way that, at least in psychology, we do this work. It's not strange.
For sure. I would not have known that 2 years ago, but now that I'm engaged to a cognitive psychologist who solely does research, he doesn't teach, he's just a researcher. I now know that that's a critical thing, and it's part of the discussion every time. And he'll be involved in papers that have maybe 26 authors. So where you fall on that list, it might be that you just worked on 2 or 3 paragraphs of the paper versus being kind of the lead of a study. So it does really matter.
Right. And don't be afraid to have that conversation. It's totally normal for behavioral and social scientists.
Well, I have learned a whole heck of a lot, and we're almost out of time already. But this has been such a treat to have both of you on the podcast and to see you guys. We do always like to end with some short rapid fire questions. And so, Shana, I promise this won't, well, at least my question will not be related to music theory. Okay. But I don't know what Ben and Jen have cooked up. But these are just, short, quick, answers off the cuff, and hopefully we have a good time with this. I can go first because I think I went last time, or last chat. So all right, so my question, I have it's a two-parter. So Shana, this is for you. So what is the one music related topic that Benjamin really digs that you just can't get into? And then Benjamin, yours is the opposite. What is the one thing that Shana just loves about some psychological concept or topic that she just digs, and you're just like, oh, this again? Can you think of maybe one of those things that that your spouse just loves to get excited about, talk about, and you're like, all right, fine, but you just don't really see it yourself?
Okay, this is a little bit of a twist. I hope that's okay. A pivot. because this is not something that Ben's necessarily super into or like his area of specialization. But all he has to say is like, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher it. Pierre Lunaire. Oh, geez. And I'm like, oh, God.
That's pretty good.
No, that's hilarious.
Oh, no. Not the mad clown.
Well, and of course I torture you with it.
Yeah. So that's a fun
Does
thing
he
that
like
happens in
play
the house.
it like on Spotify or just talk
Or,
about
you
it,
know,
or-
boop, 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 boop. You know, that's all it takes.
That was awesome.
I like that.
Thanks.
Sounds very similar. All right, Ben, what do you say?
Okay, so my answer is, of course, that everything that Shana says about psychology is absolutely fascinating. Everything. No. So Shana is super impressive in her statistical wizardry, which I've already talked about, and I just get none of it. Like, I think I knew what chi-square was at one point in my life. But Shana is just super awesome. And she really loves teaching students about statistics. And it's so far beyond me that I tend to like glaze over when she's talking about some of the statistics, like one-way ANOVA, 8-factor, whatever. I have no idea what's going on. But really the stuff that she does with memory and autobiographical memory, false memory is all just incredibly fascinating. But statistics, ooh.
Yeah, that's great. You can't have two married academics without having this these very particular interests, and that's why we're doing it. That's why we're in our fields, is right, because we're excited about these very small things that are really important to us. So Ben or Jen, take it away.
I can
Have
go.
one, Ben? You go.
Sure. I was going to ask you two, and I think you both can answer this really well. If you had to give a message to the incoming freshman class of music majors, maybe one sentence or two, what would you say?
Be open to failing, and then be willing to do better.
There you go. Failure is not failure. I've been quoted on this before.
You've been quoted. I love that.
Just
Failure
on
is not-
Facebook. It's not in a citation or anything like that. I'm not nearly as cool as you are.
Oh man, that's a lot of pressure. Yeah. I think, I would agree with be willing to try new things, try things that are hard, and see it as an opportunity to grow and change. Yeah.
Your professors, undergraduate professors are going to be so excited to see you struggle with something and then keep on struggling and continue to work until you get it. So much more than if you stay in your comfort zone. So be willing to fail, and then be willing to try to do better.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love
that's a
that.
good answer.
Really good answers. Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to bring it back around to growth mindset. Having learned about growth mindset, what is an area, something that you've been impacted by the idea of growth mindset for yourself, for your own life, work, whatever?
So mine has nothing to do with music. It has to do with, and I'm sorry, Jen and Shana, you're going to roll your eyes as soon as I start talking about this. It has to do with running. I started running about a year ago, and so I played football in high school. You can't see my picture here, but I was a really, really big guy for most of my life. And I started running a year ago, and I ran a mile, and it was just so hard. And then the next day ran 1.1 miles, 1.2 miles, and got up, and my birthday last year, I ran my very first 5K, and I was absolutely thrilled about it. And I was like, you know what? I think I could go farther. So I signed up for a 10K. I did that in December. I did an ugly sweater run in Asheville, North Carolina, in the mountains. It was absolutely beautiful. And then I signed up for a half marathon and did a half marathon in February. And I have now signed up for a full marathon, and I'm going to run my first full marathon in November. And to me, nothing captures my attitude about mindset and growth mindset than going from this guy who a year ago, last July, could barely run a mile to, I can't run a marathon yet, but I know that by November, when November rolls around, I'm going to be able to run that marathon. And that to me is just all about growth mindset. I can't do this yet, but I'm going to work at it. I'm going to work really hard at it. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, but it's going to happen for me.
I didn't roll my eyes at all. I have actually found watching that whole process really inspiring. So
Thanks.
there you go.
Same. No eye rolls.
I'll add one side note is that when I asked the great Wynton Marsalis, and I think he does deserve the great in front of the name, what is your advice to young musicians, somebody like me, a young trumpet player? This was me just nerding out in front of Wynton Marsalis. And he talked about running. And he said, if you want to go out and run a marathon, go out and run a quarter mile. And then the next day run a half mile. And the next day run 3/4 of a mile. Yeah. And, it's kind of interesting, that connection there. There's something obviously to just overcoming that. You take it in small chunks and you meet that achievable goal. And then you feel better about it and you work up to the next one. And it's not easy, but you can get there.
Yeah, when I hand students back homework that I've graded, I don't expect for it to be perfect. When they turn it back into me for a resubmission, I want it to be a little bit better. I want them to have gotten a few points back. They're not going to get 100 when they get that paper back. Everything isn't going to be fixed, but I want it to be a little bit better. Then the next time they're going to start from there. I'm going to grade it, and then I want it to be a little bit better. It's the exact same process.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an all at once.
For sure. Shana, do you have a growth mindset moment?
Yeah, actually, this is more kind of like a personal skill set area, and it's managing my self-talk. My good friend Jenn knows all about this, the inner landscape, and just sort of intervening, when I'm kind of being mean to myself internally. And this is true for a lot of academics. We're really hard on ourselves, have a lot of negative self-talk, and that's a skill set though, that you can practice, you can change, you can grow. And so, I think this has been helpful in that arena of my personal and professional life.
I love that. And for our listeners, when she said that's something lots of academics struggle with, all 5 of us were nodding yes. And it's a very common thing to feel, negative sometimes towards our own abilities and ideas and things like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we wrap up, can we give a final call out to your project? So if our listeners are interested in participating or learning more about your studies, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I don't live on social media. There's nowhere you can find me there. The only place you can find me is at my institutional page. So I'm Benjamin Dobbs, and my email address is benjamin.dobbs@furman.edu. So that's DOBBS, and then FURMAN, benjamin.dobbs@furman.edu. Shoot me an email, and I can send you some information about our study, and you can maybe consider recruiting your students to be participants in our study, your undergraduate students. And I would very happily receive those emails. Or if you want some more ideas, you're thinking you might get into scholarship of teaching and learning research, and you want some ideas how a music theorist goes about doing that, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to have a chat to at least maybe point you in some directions that you might consider going. But shoot me an email, find me at Furman's webpage, and I'd love to discuss any of this.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.